Good morning. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. On this beautiful morning, as we continue our time with each other, we're so grateful for the abiding presence of your Spirit, so grateful for the ways that your love surrounds us and enfolds us. Bless this time. Pray that what we talk about here will be helpful and fruitful, and that grace will abound, and that you will use this for good. And as always, we pray that in the name and in the Spirit of Christ. Amen. Well, so welcome. Those of you who were last week know that we spent time last week discussing theological issues around the personhood of an embryo. At what point do we talk about what a woman carries in her womb as being an ensouled human being? And you will remember, if you were here, there's been historically a range of opinion in the church about that. And to this day, there are differences of opinion about that. And so we spent time reflecting on what are some of the issues that surround that? What are some of the things that we as a community of faith should be thinking about when we approach the whole idea of personhood, and particularly the personhood of an embryo or fetus. But of course, that's only part of the discussion when it comes to abortion. Equally important is the pregnant woman. What are the rights, the responsibilities of pregnant women? How are they authorized to exercise their rights and responsibilities and make choices for themselves? Again, I want to approach this not from the point of view of United States law. I want to approach this from the point of view of theology and the practice of the church. And so spend some time, as we did last week, just sort of going over some of the thoughts and concerns we should be discussing as we treat this very important issue. And so to get going, I want to make three preliminary points, and they're all really important to sort of getting at this issue from the point of view of the Christian community. The one pertains to the status of women in the early church. Something really remarkable happened in the early church, and that was this amazing sense of full participation by women. Paul talks about it in Galatians. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There's no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. There was, for the time, a radical sense of women being the peers and equals of men. We see this in leadership. Mary Magdalene, Lydia, Prisca, Persis, others exercised leadership roles in the early church. They're not secondary, they are primary partners. Mary Magdalene is the apostle to the apostles. And so as a result, we see in action this kind of theology. We also see that both Jesus and Paul hold up singlehood, being single, as a worthy thing. And again, for women at that time, that's a radical statement. It said that women did not have to find their role and their vocation necessarily as wives and as mothers. If they chose, they could forego that, and they could be prophets and leaders in the church. And we see that some of them were. So again, for that day, that age, that culture, that was a radical sense, that women were autonomous enough they could do that. And there was also a sense of sexual equality, that in the actual intimacy of a marriage, men and women were to perceive themselves as being equal. So it is that Paul talks in 1 Corinthians, for the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a certain time. So these are remarkable statements that we might sort of take for granted in our current day and age, but in the first century Israel, that was quite a statement. But what we also see by the end of the New Testament period is this sort of radical, this sort of very freeing sense of women and men being equal. It begins to fade. And the church starts to give way to the social pressures of the time, and especially by the 4th century, when the church is just a part of society, we see that radical equality really sort of go away. And yet again, there's a more patriarchal structure. Women are definitely subservient to men, and that becomes sort of the standard for life in the church for centuries. And some would say we're still trying to dig our way out of that. I will remind you that it wasn't until the 1960s that a woman could serve in the vestry of this church. It wasn't until 1976 that the Episcopal Church ordained women. So it's been a long process that is not complete. But in terms of our subject for today, the early church had a DNA of empowered equal women. But when that goes away and it's replaced by sort of normal patriarchal attitudes and viewpoints, that has a definite impact on discussions of abortion in several ways. One way, which many people are not aware of, is that men exercise authority over women in almost every realm except pregnancy and childbirth. Now, I was present for the birth of my children, but that's a really new phenomenon. My father had 5 kids. He wasn't there for any of those births. It's really pretty new and unique to our culture that men are there involved. For the vast majority of church history, men had nothing to do with childbirth. It was the domain of women, midwives, female relatives, female neighbors. And those women in that context had full autonomy to do what they thought was right. And it was, for men, a problematic thing because these women were exercising authority apart from male structures. And sometimes those midwives, those female relatives would give medicines and potions that would induce a miscarriage and cause abortion because they felt like they needed to do that. Now, we saw last week that in the medieval church, there was general agreement that, or at least for the first 40 days, that embryo was not a person. But that wasn't the problem. Because, as we've seen too often in church history, when women exercise power apart from male supervision, very often they are accused of witchcraft. And that is what happened in the medieval and early modern periods. Abortion was roundly condemned not because of fetal life, but because it was sorcery. And the women who did it were accused of being sorcerers. Some of them burned at the stake. I point that out because it's an example of power dynamics at work. It's also a reminder to us that you can be anti-abortion without being pro-life. You can be against the practice of abortion without being particularly concerned about the well-being of a fetus. There are other things that enter in. Now, that is one example. The second one, though, is much more compelling, and that is the problem of sex. Sex does present the church with all sorts of problems. And we talked last week about different viewpoints about when ensouled human life begins. But that wasn't really the dominating issue in this topic in the early church. So, for example, look at the Council of Elvira, church council, sort of typical of its time, held in Spain. That council, abortion came up, and it was roundly condemned. Why? Because it was associated with adultery, and women would use abortion to hide their sin. And we see that increasingly in the early church, that abortion was associated not with the destruction of fetal life, but with fornication and with adultery. And women were accused of using it to basically hide their sin and not be held accountable. And so increasingly, church councils, the church hierarchy, condemned abortion without reference to the fetal life, but because it was associated with sexual misbehavior. That was true not just outside of marriage. It was true within marriage. And so not only does it become associated with adultery and with fornication. It's associated with contraception. I say the church has a problem with sex, and we do. From the very get-go, we've had a largely celibate male hierarchy that has a very hard time understanding the value and purpose of sex within a marriage. So the institutional church more and more said the only role of sex is procreation. That is why a husband and wife should have sex. And every sexual act should be open to the production of children. For a married couple to have a number of children and decide they have too many to deal with and then choose abortion is wrong, because abortion would not be needed if they just exercised restraint and didn't have sex. In other words, if you don't want to have any more children, you just don't have any more sexual intercourse. This was a common teaching. Caesarius of Aros was a bishop. A woman who does not want to have children should enter into a religious pact with her husband, for chastity is the only sterility for a Christian woman. So the idea of sex as bonding, sex as intimacy, sex as pleasure with your spouse didn't matter. Even within marriage, if it wasn't for procreation, sex was lust, and sex was wrong for many of the leaders of the early church. And a lot of the vitriol about abortion, a lot of the energy around abortion really comes from that attitude. We see it with Augustine. You'll remember Augustine last week. He freely admits he doesn't know when ensouled human life begins. But he's still against abortion, not because of fetal life, but because of lust. So, for example, in his treatise on marriage, Augustine says this: this lustful cruelty, or cruel lust, i.e. having sex without trying to procreate or wanting to procreate, reaches the point that it procures poisons, and if nothing else has worked, destroys and pours out by some means fetuses conceived in the womb, wanting its offspring to die before it lives. Again, if both are like this, they're not spouses, they're just sex partners. But if both are not like this, then I dare say that either she is, in a sense, her husband's whore, or he is his wife's adulterer. That was very common. There was a sense that if married couples are not exercising restraint, then they're guilty of lust. And the point was that you should never have too many children so that you need an abortion, because you can just control yourself, and then that won't be a problem. And this becomes really the dominant thinking in the church for centuries. So that when you remember last week, the medieval church definitely thought there was a delayed ensoulment. They did not think it happened at conception, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was sexual misbehavior. And what becomes even more apparent is that it becomes an engendered issue. It's a woman's problem. The church was very zealous in holding pregnant women accountable. It was not zealous in holding to account the men who impregnated them. So it increasingly becomes something that's associated solely with women, even though, of course, in the case of a problem pregnancy, there was a man involved. This has gone up as an issue to the present day, and so much so that Beverly Harrison, Presbyterian theologian, taught at Union Seminary in New York for many years, wrote, "I find no evidence until the modern period that compassion for the presumed child in the womb was a generating source of Christian moral opposition to abortion. Rather, the overwhelming opposition expressed for centuries was opposition to sexual misbehavior on the part of women and the need to control women and to prevent such sexual misbehavior." That's part of our baggage as a church, and we just need to own that. It still plays out in many ways. We talked about probabilism last week, and I said there is a critique of probabilism that comes from within the Roman Catholic Church itself. You remember, probabilism says that We don't know. The Roman Catholic Magisterium says we don't know when ensouled life begins. We don't know when a blastocyst or an embryo or a fetus actually becomes an ensouled person. But because there's a likelihood at any point of the way that it is, we will always treat that fetus as a person. Carol Tower, who's a Roman Catholic bioethicist, though, points out, along with many others, sort of the flaw with this thinking. The flaw with the thinking is that in traditional moral discourse, uncertain status means you have uncertain rights. So if you're saying that a fetus has uncertain status, the rights are not certain. But the pregnant woman is a definite person with definite status and definite rights. Moral Reasoning 101 says that if you have a case where you have to weigh uncertain rights with certain rights, you always give deference to the person with certain rights. The Roman Catholic Church does just the opposite. It gives deference to a potential person with potential rights instead of the rights of the actual person whose status is established. Why? Well, what Carol Tower and quite a few writers point out is there is such an institutional misogyny within the Roman Church. Just a deeply embedded suspicion of female sexuality and an ingrained need to try to control women. So much so that it violates its own moral thinking. This is the critique that is offered. Again, these aren't people throwing stones from outside the church. This is from within the Roman Catholic Church itself. I'm not picking on the Roman Church. It's the largest church, though, and it dominates Christian discussion in this country and in Europe about abortion. So, the problem of sex is a problem. Problem of suspicion of sexual pleasure, sexism, misogyny, these issues all enter into play. Finally, the acceptance of mitigating circumstances. From the beginning, Christian writers have said that the life of the mother always takes priority. Even Tertullian, who believed that the soul existed from the moment of conception, even Tertullian said, absolutely, you kill the fetus if the mother's in danger. So that's never been in dispute in the church. But it wasn't just the woman's life that could be a mitigating circumstance. So, for example, in the late antique period, early medieval period, there were a lot of what are called penitential manuals that were distributed. They were used by priests. So people would come for confession, and they would confess sins, and the priest would use these manuals as sort of guides for how much penance to assign. Forget about whether you think that's a good idea or not, okay? It gives them insight into the mind of the church. And what's so amazing when you read through all these penitential manuals is how lenient they were towards abortion. Abortion was often considered a sin because of sexual misbehavior. But if a woman was raped, she was not culpable. She could get an abortion. And not just that. If a woman was poor, if a woman was struggling, the manuals would say, you need to cut her slack. She has a reason why she did that, which is sort of remarkable. And for example, there's one that comes from, attributed to Bede, that says, but it makes a great difference whether a poor woman does this, gets an abortion, because of the difficulty of rearing, or a fornicating woman for the sake of hiding her crime. So there is a tradition in the church going back centuries that, yeah, you might be too poor to raise a child. Yeah, you might not be capable of raising a child. And that was accepted. Now, eventually those penitential manuals go away. They give way to canon law. Canon law, by definition, is legalistic, juridical. But the penitential manuals were pastoral. They dealt with real women, living real lives, making real choices in the real world. And the real world is messy. So I say all this because all of this factors in to a discussion about abortion. It's not just a clean, clinical discussion about the theological, philosophical nature of a fetus. It's also about women who are living in a world and in a system that can be very difficult to navigate. And that is often within the life of the church prejudiced against them. So we can see this play out a couple ways. I'll just give you a couple of examples. The Bible doesn't talk about abortion. But there are two biblical images, motifs, that just are dominant in discussion about abortion within the church. The first one, of course, the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. So pro-life writers, of course, embrace Mary. They see Mary, just like Eve was the mother of fallen women, Mary is the mother of redeemed women, and Mary was a mother. And she embraced her motherhood of Christ, and as a result, she holds up as an icon what women are called to be. So you can find in many pro-life writers, especially within the Catholic and evangelical traditions, this sense that you can not only not do abortion, there really should never be an unwanted pregnancy, because every pregnancy is an opportunity for a woman to fulfill her nature. Monica Miller is one of the primary writers in this. She writes voluminously. I will just quote it, just a summary that another scholar gives of her work. While not every woman will achieve biological reproduction, her divinely given female essence is the receptivity to male initiative and maternal nurturing of life. According to Miller, women achieve their fullest feminine authority in the church to the extent that they freely accept their role, as Mary did, as giver and protector of life. Miller makes the pro-life connection, asserting that abortion is not only the unjust taking of fetal life, the act reverberates by severing the woman from her own powerful life-giving essence. Miller's pro-life argument thus hinges on an interpretation of Mary as first among other women who assent to and cooperate with the particular kind of maternal empowerment that is uniquely theirs as female. There's a lot of this out there. Basically, abortion is wrong not just because it kills a fetus, it violates a woman's nature. And every woman should be a mother. If they're not a biological mother, they should be a spiritual mother, a nun, a teacher, a nurse. If they don't do that, they are not fulfilling their nature, their God-given nature. You don't have to look far to find this in websites and even among scholarly writers. Monica Miller was a lecturer at Marquette University. So there is one tradition that holds Mary up as the exemplar of mother. It probably will not surprise you to know that there is some strong pushback against that by other Christians who write that holding Mary up is problematic. Within the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, she's considered perpetually virgin. So to hold Mary as an ideal is to say she's a mother who has no sexual needs and desires at all, which is to say she's not really human. And not a role model that most women could aspire to or would want to aspire to. Those people writing in that vein say Mary's been co-opted. If you read scripture, their argument is that she is in fact very real, very human. She is perplexed. She is concerned by the angel's response to her, and she chooses to be pregnant. She exercises autonomy. And so people writing from the pro-choice point of view say Mary is a great role model, but she's not a great role model of perfect motherhood. She's a great role model of a woman empowered to choose. So, for example, Tina Beatty, Mary was not forced to bear the Messiah. Acting as a responsible moral agent, she made her own choice. So you can see, you can take the same biblical idea and hear different things and approach it in different ways. That is also true of the second motif that comes up all the time in abortion discussions, which may surprise you, and that is the Good Samaritan. Pro-life writers really talk about the Good Samaritan a lot. You'll remember the story, guy beaten up beside of the road, priest walks by, Levite walks by, the Samaritan comes, helps them. Well, this comes up a lot because in the pro-life writing, pro-life writers see the unwanted fetus as that beat up person on the side of the road that needs help. And that the pregnant woman is called to be a good neighbor to that fetus. It will involve sacrifice. It will involve stretching herself. It will involve maybe doing what she doesn't want to do, but it's the right Christ-like thing to do, to offer what the writers call radical hospitality. Actually, the term they like to use is gestational hospitality. That to be a good Samaritan to the fetus is a woman's obligation and her role in Christ. It's a very common image among writers. So, pro-choice writers also like the Good Samaritan, but for different reasons. And they go to the end of the story. You remember it. A Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever you spend." So what pro-choice writers say in response is that, well, this is an act of genuine compassion. That's limited. He takes him to an inn, spends 1 day with him, and then pays somebody else to take care of him. And then the Samaritan goes on his way. And a denarius, it's real money, it's about a day's wage, but it's not a fortune. So in the story, he does a good thing, but it's a very doable thing. And as a result, pro-choice writers will say, you cannot compare that to pregnancy, where you're asking a woman to go 9 months being pregnant and then spend years, and who knows how much money, raising a child. Comparing the two stories doesn't make sense. In fact, pro-choice writers then say, in that point of view, you have made the pregnant woman not the Good Samaritan, you've made her the animal who's forced to carry the body without any choice in the matter. Pro-choice writers say, this is a great story. But instead of seeing in that man beaten in the road a potential person, we should see a real person. We should see a woman in a crisis pregnancy. Because what happens often with women in crisis pregnancy? The priest walks by, the Levite walks by, their churches abandon them, they don't give them support, they don't help them. And so as a result, really, if we want to embrace this image, we should see that woman as the person needing our help and our assistance, even to the point of maybe having to procure an abortion for her. So again, same story, 2 very different approaches that illustrate just the different ways that the Christian community deals with this. So, think about last week, think about this week. Is abortion a sin? Well, there are those who say that an embryo from the moment of conception is an ensouled human person. The destruction of that life is the destruction of a human person. It's wrong. There are those who say that for a woman not to embrace a pregnancy is a violation of her maternal nature, and that doing that in and of itself is wrong. There are those who say that not only is abortion a sin, it often compounds sexual misbehavior, which makes it even worse sin. And for those viewpoints, abortion is a sin. It is wrong. There are those who will say, well, may not be the worst sin. It may be the lesser of 2 evils. That it's possible that while it's taking of a human life, if, for example, a woman is raped, that making her bear that child is an unbearable burden. And so while abortion may not be the best thing, it's a better thing. It's the lesser of 2 evils. In the same way that you shouldn't kill somebody, but maybe occasionally as an act of self-defense, it's justifiable. And then you get people who would say that abortion can be and often is the morally right decision. It is right for the woman who is pregnant. It is right for the potential child who could be born, because if that woman is not able or willing to raise a child, it's that child who will suffer the consequences. Pro-choice writers will also point out the essence of sin is broken relationship with God. You can, it's done, have women who are prayerful in their decision to have an abortion. It doesn't sever their relationship with God. They do it in the context of their relationship with God, and they do it because they think it is the best, right, moral choice. So the church, as a church, there's a spectrum. And that leads to the next obvious question. Who decides? Well, for those who think that abortion is a sin, for the various reasons we listed, there's a strong emphasis that a church, a Congress, or a legislature should be the decider. They should draw clear lines that cannot be crossed because it's a sin. And like murder and like other sins, it needs to be stopped at a legislative level, at a hierarchical level. For those who do not see it as a sin, the argument is this is such a complex issue. The stakes are high. There are many risks involved. There's a great deal of uncertainty. The only person with the moral authority to make that decision is the pregnant woman. Nobody else can make it for her. Both of those viewpoints are expressed by Christian writers, Christian theologians, and popular writers, and they're both very much in the context of Christian discourse on this issue. Now, finally, thank you, I will be done shortly. The Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church does have a statement on abortion. It dates from 1994 General Convention. It's not been revised since then, so this is the current statement from the Episcopal Church. It's 3 slides worth, but I'll read them quickly. Resolved that this 71st General Convention of the Episcopal Church reaffirms blah, blah, blah. All human life is sacred from its inception until death. The Church takes seriously its obligation to help form the consciences of its members concerning the sacredness. Human life, therefore, should be initiated only advisedly and in full accord with this understanding of the power to conceive and give birth which is bestowed by God. It is a responsibility of our congregations to assist their members in becoming informed concerning the spiritual and physiological aspects of sex and sexuality. The Book of Common Prayer affirms that the birth of a child is a joyous and solemn occasion in the life of a family. It is also an occasion for rejoicing in the Christian community. As Christians, we also affirm responsible family planning. We regard all abortion as having a tragic dimension, calling forth the concern and compassion of all the Christian community. While we acknowledge that in this country it is the legal right, this is 1994, of every woman to have a medically safe abortion, as Christians we believe strongly that if this right is exercised, it should be used only in extreme situations. We emphatically oppose abortion as a means of birth control, family planning, sex selection, or any reason of mere convenience. In those cases where an abortion is being considered, members of this church are urged to seek the dictates of their consciences in prayer, to seek the advice and counsel of members of the Christian community, and where appropriate, the sacramental life of this church. Whenever members of this church are consulted with regard to a problem pregnancy, they are to explore with grave seriousness with the person or persons seeking advice and counsel as alternatives to abortion, other positive courses of action, including, but not limited to, the following possibilities. The parents raising the child, another family member raising the child, making the child available for adoption. It is a responsibility of members of this church, especially the clergy, to become aware of local agencies and resources which will assist those faced with problem pregnancies. We believe that legislation concerning abortions will not address the root of the problem. We therefore express our deep conviction that any proposed legislation on the part of national or state governments regarding abortions must take special care to see that the individual conscience is respected and that the responsibility of individuals to reach informed decisions in this matter is acknowledged and honored as the position of this church. And be it further resolved that the 71st General Convention of the Episcopal Church express its unequivocal opposition to any legislative, executive, or judicial action on the part of local, state, or national governments that abridges the right of a woman to reach an informed decision about the termination of pregnancy, or that would limit the access of a woman to safe means of acting on her decision. The most recent convention in just this summer in Baltimore didn't state the whole statement, but it does come down strongly opposed to any restrictions on a woman's right to seek and to procure an abortion. So that's a lot to throw at you. on a Sunday morning. But I'm going to stop there and invite any thoughts or questions you might have.
I would just like to ask, does that determine any age, stage of the pregnancy? Can that be full term?
Any age of the fetus, you mean? It doesn't specify.
It did say from the moment of inception.
It recognizes human life is sacred from the moment of inception, but it does not, you're right, it does not put a time limit on when that would cease being an acceptable option.
And I also have another question. I believe I'm an autonomous woman because I have my own thoughts and feelings, but I'm happily married. And it takes two to tango. And I don't see any mention in here other than because of the woman back in the early church. It was always the woman who was accused of being bad, never the man.
Yeah.
Why are we? I'm tired of divisiveness. It seems to me that this topic also has to include both sides, so that we. And I also will tell you that I had a horrible experience of a full-term baby that had to be removed from me. You never forget that. And I think this doesn't take into consideration the whole story.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, this statement does not talk about the father, the men, it doesn't. I'm not politically connected in the church. I don't know all the ins and outs of why this is still the current statement. I know anecdotally lots of people are not happy with it. But that is right now the current statement of the Episcopal Church.
Yes, so go back to the idea of probabilism and from the inception. I'm not clear on what the church is saying.
Well, probabilism is the Roman Catholic Church's position, and it's about personhood, not about human life. Everyone would agree that an embryo is human life. It talks about, in this statement, human life also. It doesn't say human person. And the issue in probabilism is, when does that human life become an ensouled human person?
Inception is different from that.
Well, this statement says that, all human life is sacred from its inception until death. So human life is sacred. It uses that word deliberately. It doesn't talk about human person. Probabilism deals with when does that human life in the womb become a human person with a soul. Probabilism says we don't know, but since we don't know, we should treat it always as if it were a person with a soul. This statement doesn't actually address probabilism. It doesn't address personhood. It just acknowledges that it is human life.
So, how do you define personhood then? Like, for instance, a child that is so affected when they're born, a regional logical person would not say that's not a person in the sense that they will perform the acts that we associate with being a person.
Right. Well, we talked about that last week, and you're right. There are difficulties involved in personhood, especially in those kinds of extreme situations. And this is what the kinds of thing the church debates. What point can we say this is not a person, or what point are we obligated to say it is a person? And there's a variety of opinion, for sure. But what you raise is a good point. Yes.
That analogy with the Good Samaritan seems like a stretch to me. I would have never guessed that, but it's apparently common.
It's very common.
How and when did that get started?
I don't know. It's been around, my whole ministry. Samaritanism is a pro-life. It's very common. The idea being, again, that you calling the woman to, offer radical hospitality to this fetus, even if she does not want it. Yeah. Yes.
It seems like the personhood argument, to get it away from abortion, would work at the other end of the spectrum. If somebody is brain dead in a hospital, are they still a person, but they are human life? Do you pull the plug? I'm sure the Episcopal Church has a stance.
There's similar statement, end of life issues are issues because there are people, I've certainly seen them pastorally, their heart's still beating, but their family would say they're not there. They were a person, they're no longer a person, but it's human life, of course. So there are similarities for sure.
So
Yeah.
in that situation, the family members speak for the person. Logic would stand to reason that the mother can speak for that person as well.
Yeah.
I know there's obviously different problems with the same analogy, but
No, but yes, right. Who decides then? Well, yeah, we generally let family decide in an end-of-life situation. So, yes, like it could be analogous and similar for the beginning of life.
yeah.
Yes, Len.
How are they defining conception there? I'm not really.
They didn't. So, and we talked about this last week because conception is actually a process, isn't it? It's not just, you could say it's the sperm fertilizing an egg, but then the egg becomes a zygote, and the zygote goes down in the fallopian tube and becomes a blastocyst, has to implant itself on the wall of the uterus. The whole process can take 2
But
weeks.
they're saying inception.
Yeah, and they don't define what they mean by
Right,
that.
they chose their word carefully, didn't they?
It may be deliberately vague. Like I say, I'm not involved in the wording here. Yes, Linda.
Is there a movement among the national church to change this particular thesis that we are reading?
Not that I'm aware of.
Based on current,
I don't know is the answer. I know that there are people not happy with the statement on both sides of the issue, but I don't know if there's an organized movement to change it. Yes.
So this is an American issue, the American Episcopal Church. Is it, is it similar in England? Is it similar in some of the African churches? The statement? And this is an American statement.
Yeah, this is an American statement. This is just pertains to the Episcopal Church USA. I couldn't speak to any other church.
Does each bishop have his own right to say in his diocese?
No, that's not the way. No, this is the General Convention statement. No one is authorized to change it. Clearly, individuals can embrace it or reject it. Our church is such, our authority structure is such that no one has to subscribe to that. That's just, the church assembled, this is the mind of the church from convention. Individual Episcopalians could strongly disagree with it, and some do, and don't have to follow it.
I just have one thing to say, I'm back here struggling. The title of this talk is The Autonomy of Women, right? Of today's talk. And there's one sentence maybe on slide 3 of what you have up there now that talks about a woman needing to make an informed decision. And we're still talking about, when a baby is a person but the woman, I think this whole thing is about the woman making her own prayerful, informed, educated, moral decision. And I think that's the crux of what I've seen today, or what you presented today. And it makes me think, in my family, and I'm of a certain age where, stuff happened and you had to do something about it because there was a social problem, right? It wasn't socially acceptable. This has happened several times in my family when I was really young, and it just strikes me that didn't provide any of my siblings any autonomy either, and what a rotten shame. They very well might have reached the decision of what happened because they were young women. But it's just so rotten that nobody is saying, or that we're trying to say, but we don't seem to sit with that and be really convicted to it, that it is the woman who needs to really come to the forefront here. We've forgotten, or we've never even considered something.
Thank you. My point in doing these two forums is just, you could spend months on this. It's just to raise consciousness, to encourage people to be thinking. It's such an issue in our society. And it's a legal issue, it's a justice issue, it's a political issue. I get all that. But as faithful members of the church, we want to just be aware. What are we thinking about this? How do we approach it? And we certainly don't want to necessarily give way to some of the subconscious things the currents that flow in our history that are not always very helpful. We want to be aware. We want to be conscious and aware and thinking through this in ways that we believe are conducive to furthering the cause of Christ in the world. So I appreciate your patience, appreciate you being here, and enjoy the rest of your day. God bless.